May our prayers come before you, O God, as incense, and may your presence surround and fill us, so that in union with all creation, we might sing your praise and your love in our lives. Amen. Amen.
A reading from Genesis. The Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you, and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So Abraham went, as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Word of God, word of life.
Thanks be to God.
As I think about this reading, it's interesting to me that I picked a reading that says go when the rest of the world seems to be telling people to stay. But here we are. As we continue our focus on stories this week, we're going to highlight some stories tonight from people who have spent some significant time working and living abroad in another culture at some point in their lives, and how those experiences have shaped their spiritual journey. So thanks to the three of you for being willing to share your stories with us this evening. Before we dive into your stories, help us get to know you a little bit. Tell us your name, who you are, how long you've been at Mount Olive, and what sorts of groups, activities that you're involved in.
My name is Brad Natsky, and I've been at Mount Olive for just about 20 years now, and I participate in the brass group as well as on the Worship and Arts Committee team and the facilities team.
I'm Kristen Mannix. I have also been at Mount Olive for 20 years with an 11-year hiatus in Australia. You will know me because I have 3 loud and noisy kids, so that will stand out. And we like to do, my husband and I like to do brass and choir, and I'm currently helping out with the youngest singing group.
I'm Terry Krieger, and my family has also been here for about 20 years. If you were here long enough, you probably noticed when my wife and I brought that guy home. He was a little baby. We brought him home from Colombia 16 years ago. And the second one, he's actually at a friend's church tonight, so he's not here. That's Joey, and Daniel's the other one. I participate, I'm in mutual ministry team, and I enjoy going to pub theology.
Now, tell us a little bit about your time living and working abroad, how you ended up there, what it was like, and how that experience played a role in your spiritual journey.
Well, for me, my dad was a missionary in Brazil. We went down there when I was in 3rd grade, and he and my mom both were very intentional about integrating us into the local culture. Typically, missionaries' kids would be sent off to a boarding school somewhere so that they can still learn in English. But they had us at home, and we went to a Brazilian school and learned to speak Portuguese. So that was a big deal. My dad had about 10, maybe 11 congregations that he was responsible for. One was a primary one next to the house, or next to the parsonage that we lived in, and about 10 other ones scattered around the city. It was a pretty big metropolitan area, but he also had congregations significantly out in the country that would take several hours to get to. And we were able to go with him on occasion. Sometimes he would only go once a month to these congregations, but very strong faiths in these locations. Grateful to have somebody come out and have a service even as infrequently as monthly. The people that we knew, even in the primary congregation where my dad was a pastor, the people had little wealth. they weren't poor, but not extravagant living. And one of the things that we were blessed with being a pastor's family, is that whenever we went to visit people, they would bring out a feast of food, which was way more than they would normally have, and probably set them back quite a bit. But that was a demonstration of their faith as well. And so for me, it demonstrated faith being an integral part of one's life, and that it's significantly bigger than material possessions. I remember being a kid and worrying about material things at the time. I'd always ask my dad, "Are we rich?" Because being an American in Brazil, I mean, the answer is yes, even a pastor's salary. But I'd ask him anyway, and he'd say, "No, we're rich in the Spirit." That was always his response, and it was so frustrating. But it stuck with me, and that's part of who I am now as well. That it's bigger than material things.
Well, I was told I have a time limit, which if you've experienced any conversation with me, this is going to be a real struggle. So I have two things I really want to focus on. So my experience, I went to Australia full of wanderlust, an opportunity to experience a new place. And my husband and I had lived in England, and we were very excited about that prospect. But I want to just take a moment to talk about the faith it takes to leap into a new culture. And Australia is not vastly different from the US. We have a lot of shared history and a lot of shared practice and that sort of thing. But my husband and I had decided we were going to move to Australia. And in the process of getting our visa, my dad contracted a chronic health condition. And for the first 3 years of this condition, he managed it pretty well. He was on an experimental drug. He wasn't having to have blood transfusions monthly like he had been, and we were very hopeful. And after I'd quit my job, and we had announced to the world we were planning to leave, the drug stopped working, and we had to make a choice. I prayed so hard for a sign of what choice we should make. And I remember after a sleepless night, sitting down to pray and on the floor in front of my couch, and I was distraught between choosing this dream that we had and the reality that while we were away, something terrible could happen and my father would pass. And at one moment in that fervent prayer, I had this very clear feeling it's going to be okay. Now, in my naivete, I interpreted that to mean they will find a new treatment for your dad. What it meant was that while I was away, I would find a community that would hold me during his loss. I found friends who also lost their father in the same month that I lost mine, and we became incredibly close. And I was angry that I had read the sign, which seemed so clear, so wrong. But through that experience of being, in some ways, isolated from the supports that I had, I came to let go of my anger and realize it was okay. Dad was in heaven and he was okay. And I was held in this community and it was okay. But anytime you head into the unknown, there is a leap of faith. And I was placed where I needed to be when that happened. And it's helped me understand that what faith is holding on to the idea that it will be okay, even if the plan isn't my plan. And I think that everybody has that experience whether they go abroad or not, but something about the distance made the leap to leave more significant than I think a move across town or to another part of the U.S. And I think that was the biggest takeaway from the experience is that there is this Bible verse that's, have I not commanded you, be strong and courageous, do not be afraid, do not be discouraged, for the Lord will be with you wherever you go. And that's kind of what I held on to during that time. And if you want to hear what I think about Australian church culture versus this, I'll talk to you later.
I spent just over 2 years in Africa in a small country called Swaziland. If you know the map of Africa at all, down in southern Africa there are 2 little round countries. One is Lesotho, completely surrounded by South Africa, and the other one is Swaziland, and it borders Mozambique on one side. That was where I was. Very tiny country, about the size of New Jersey. So, and it's a kingdom. Very unique African country because it's homogeneous. There's only one group there, Swazis. So that's very unique if you know Africa at all. There's about 2,000 languages there. In that country, there's one, well, in English. The story of how I got there is actually, it turns out to be a giant mistake, but I'll tell you. I had a 7th grade geography teacher who gave us one class period where he showed us his service work that he did on the island of Fiji. That is east of New Zealand out in the South Pacific. And I saw that in 7th grade and I said, I'm going to do that. I want to be a Peace Corps volunteer. And so 9 years later, I was graduating from college and I signed up for the Peace Corps. Didn't tell anybody. Didn't tell my parents, didn't tell anybody, I just signed up. I eventually told them because I had to leave the country. But if you fast forward, I'm going to skip over my Peace Corps experience for just a little bit. And after I was back, I ran into my 7th grade teacher and I said, you know what? I largely joined the Peace Corps because of that one day in 7th grade. And he said, I was never in the Peace Corps. And I said, well, you showed us all these pictures of the service you did in Fiji. He was a conscientious objector, and he got drafted. So he ended up on doing his military service on the island of Fiji that looked a lot like the Peace Corps to me. So that's how I ended up there. When I arrived, we arrived in the middle of the night, and I knew immediately I was not in Kansas anymore, or Minnesota. It was dark. There were people walking along the road. They were carrying things I had never seen before on their heads. The next morning I woke up, there were monkeys in my tree. So I knew I was someplace else. There were some huge cultural differences, huge language differences, as you might imagine. It is a huge leap of faith to move into a culture like this. They speak Siswati in Swaziland, which is a cousin of Zulu. They're mutually intelligible, so if you any Zulu speakers here? No, I don't ever run into Zulu speakers. They have a lot of different customs, really a lot of things that we would not be used to. One of the things the Peace Corps likes to do is the first week you're in the country, they send you out into the wilderness and see how you handle it. I was sent out to a school, and it happened to be that they were having track and field day. So I agreed to participate, and after I got done running around the field, one of the Swazi teachers, grabbed my hand and started talking with me, and we walked diagonally all the way across the football field holding hands. Fortunately, the Peace Corps had told me that this was going to happen, so I was trained. I knew this was going to happen, but as a good German Lutheran Minnesotan, it was still really weird. But I got used to it, and by the end of my 2 years there, I felt very comfortable holding hands with men while I talked to them. That was part of the culture. I lived in a cinder block house with a tin roof and a colony of bats in the roof. They were my closest friends, I guess, while I was there. I had running water about half the time. I had electricity almost all the time. It was hot there. I remember one time I was coaching track and field, and it was just miserably hot that afternoon, and I got back to my house, and I sat down in the living room, and I thought, oh, at least it's cool in here. And I checked, it was 96 in my house. So I don't know what it was outside, but it was brutal. I will tell one short story about my faith journey there. I taught at a public school right across the road from a Catholic mission. St. Philip's was the name of the mission. And most of my students lived at that mission. It was a boarding house. And there was a big dome church there. And I went to Catholic Mass most Sundays while I was there. It was entirely in Zulu, or in Siswati, actually. I didn't understand it, but they had hymnals and books, and I could read Zulu pretty well, actually. I could pronounce the words. I didn't know what I was doing. I did tell Travis earlier, I learned all the responses to a Catholic Mass in Zulu, so that when I came back to the U.S., I knew what to say, but just not in English. But the one kind of faith story I have from Swaziland is there was another American at my school named Chris. Chris was a non-practicing Jewish guy that I met there, and he actually lost the use of one of his eyes in a childhood accident, so he had one working eye. And I remember one Saturday, Chris and I we had dinner together, and we were sitting on his front porch, and he says, "Krieger, what are you doing tomorrow?" And I said, "Well, I'm going over to the sisters." There were 3 sisters at the Catholic mission. I said, "I'm going to help them do some stuff, and then I'm going to, do some schoolwork or something." And he said sarcastically, "Krieger, you're such a good Christian, you're always doing this good stuff." And it dawned on me, in the Peace Corps, it's not a religious organization. We don't talk about religion. He didn't know I was a Christian. And he did, I guess, because I was from Minnesota and I was German and Lutheran. But he was Jewish, he was non-practicing. We just didn't talk about that stuff. That was a common thing. There were lots of Peace Corps volunteers who had some faith, some who didn't, atheists, agnostics, there were all sorts. But it reminded me of that phrase, that statement that is most commonly attributed to St. Francis, that preach the gospel always, and if necessary, use words. He never said that, by the way. If you look it up, you'll find out. But Chris assumed I was a good Christian because I was doing good things, or at least that's what he perceived. And I thought, maybe that's how we should be living. Maybe we should be showing our faith. It wasn't an intentional thing, but I learned a lot from a sarcastic, one-eyed, non-practicing Jew.
Before I let you go, if you can give us, in a couple of sentences, one spiritual insight or takeaway from your time abroad that you'd like us to know.
All right. I would say for me, the one thing I learned is that faith is everywhere. It's in the good times and in the bad. It's in the yes and the no, and God will provide.
I think the lesson that I would encourage people to think about is that sometimes we have to reach out beyond the known, the relationships that we have and the friends that we have in our comfortable space here, to have the clarity about what God is doing for us. And I want to say, so I had a moment in this church after my dad had passed and this other family whose dad had passed. We were sitting next to each other. And I was sitting in a sunbeam, and I had this incredible feeling of absolute love for the woman sitting next to me. And it came time to pass the peace, and I felt like the words "I love you" were bursting out, but I didn't say them because that's totally weird, right? And a few weeks later, she said, you know, that day I felt my dad in that service. And my German Lutheran, keep it buttoned up persona kept her from hearing that message at the moment she probably needed to hear it. So I think sometimes we have to let go of what our culture tells us and follow what faith shows us.
I think one big takeaway I learned from my time in Africa is that God's work gets done by all sorts of people. Every religion, every creed, every race, non-practicing Jews, atheists. There are a lot of people doing good things, doing God's work, and somehow God finds a way to get things done that need to get done. Swaziland's a pretty desolate place. It's poor. There's not so much starvation, but there's a lot of malnutrition. And people step up, and it's pretty amazing. So Christians, we don't have a corner on the market, but we should be leaders maybe.
All right. Well, thank you all again for sharing your time and your stories with us. Let's give them a hand.